what does logic apply to? Like, we often talk about logical arguments, right? Is it like logic is a thing which applies to arguments? Does it apply to sentences? Does it, like, what is logic?
I would suggest that
used on
logic applies to reasoning,
mm-hmm.
and quite broadly construed. If you're dealing with something like propositional logic, its subject matter is propositions. If you're dealing with something like predicate logic, its subjects are going to be predicates and objects and the logical relations between them.
Mm-hmm.
In theory, you can kind of say, well, any discourse whereby we want to guarantee the truth of our conclusion from our premises is going to be governed by some kind of logic. It is, or at least it claims to be, the kind of normative rules of thought.
Yeah.
What the original kind of intuition that Aristotle's having, or one of them, when he kind of founds logic in the Western philosophical tradition, is basically just how do I know that I'm thinking well? How do I know when I'm thinking poorly? And there are plenty of other non-logical aspects to that question. So you could say, well, one of the things you might want to figure out if your thinking to be precise would be something like, well, I ought to define all of my terms very precisely, because if I don't, then I'm not going to be quite clear on what I mean. And that's not a matter for formal logic, but it's nonetheless a kind of general rule of, or general bit of cognitive hygiene, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And but logic, I would say, tends to deal more with the idea of reasoning. So relationships between statements, propositions, terms. Basically, if this thing is true, what do I know from that?
Yeah, like what can you derive from one thing? What can you draw out of it? And so there's a term that you've used a few times now, which is the term valid.
Mm-hmm.
You've also used the word sound, which does not mean the same thing. So let's take an argument like modus ponens.
Mm-hmm.
So if P, then Q.
Mm-hmm.
P, therefore Q. The reason we use letters there is because it doesn't matter what you plug in, it's still going to work the same, right? So you could say, if the sky is red, then my bathtub is filled. The sky is red, therefore the bathtub is filled, right? It doesn't matter what sentences you put in. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. That argument is an example of a valid argument. What is validity? What is validity? I was saying the word valid, so I went to say, like, what is validity? What is validity in a logical argument?
So validity in a logical argument is there a situation whereby the premises of my argument are true and yet the conclusion is false? So, what was your example there again? Sorry.
Oh, let's pick a better one. Like, if it's raining outside, then I'll get wet.
Yes, yeah. So
premise 2, it is raining outside. Conclusion, therefore, I will get wet.
Yes, so if you accept the first two statements, you are bound by consistency to accept the final statement. There's not a situation where the first two statements are true, yet the conclusion is false.
Now, crucially, I've got to separate this out because, like, we just talked about a logical fallacy, right? This is not the same thing. So earlier we had this argument, which was, if it's raining outside, then I'll get wet. And it was then, it's not raining outside, therefore I will not get wet.
Yes.
That's invalid.
Yes.
We're doing a positive modus ponens. So it starts with the same first premise. If it's raining outside, then I'll get wet. But this time, the second premise is, it is raining outside. Therefore, I will get wet. And that whole first premise can be thought of as one. So the first premise is this if-then. If it's raining, then I'll get wet. So let's say that's true. Let's say it's just true that if it's raining, I'll get wet. Then premise 2, it's raining. Because it's true that if it's raining, I'll get wet, it means that I must, like, get wet, right?
Yes, exactly.
And that's what validity is. It means that essentially the conclusion is guaranteed by the premises.
Yes. And then that kind of guaranteed is then cashed out as there's no situation where the premises
can be true and the conclusion. And it's important that it's defined in that way. We'll get into that in a moment. But the technical definition then of validity, an argument is valid if there is, like, no sense in which the premises can be true and the conclusion be false. If it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, it means it's valid. Importantly, this does not mean that the argument is sound.
Yes, or even in any intuitive sense, good.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that to say an argument is valid does not mean that its premises and conclusion are true.
Yes, it
just means that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true.
It denotes something about its structure. We can kind of broadly, logicians often think about this in terms of syntax and semantics, but we can kind of just think about it in terms of form and content for the sake of argument today. So we can think about our previous fallacy there, affirming the consequent, is a fallacy of form. It's a formal fallacy. It is an error in the reasoning structure at play here.
It's not about the content. It's not about the actual.
No, exactly. And you can have
about the structure.
You can have an unsound argument,
right? So just to be clear,
valid. So
soundness. If an argument is sound,
it
means it's valid and also true.
Yes, exactly. So there are kind of two definitions of soundness, and rather unhelpfully, the one that I think is most useful is also the less popular one. So the most popular use of soundness is to say an argument is sound if and only if it's valid, and also all of the premises are true, and that will guarantee the truth of the conclusion, whatever's the case, right? So, let's say all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Not only is that a valid argumentative structure, it's also sound. The other way that some people use sound is just to denote that premises are true without saying anything about validity. Unhelpfully, that's not standard usage, but I also think it's very popular.
Yeah.
Unhelpfully, that's not standard usage, but I also think that it is in some sense more useful, because then you can say an argument's sort of sound but not valid.
Yeah, so we got to slow down for a second, because there's a lot of words being thrown around. We're talking about this concept of validity, and I think it's really important because it comes up a lot to distinguish validity and soundness. They're often used interchangeably. They're not the same thing. So just to give an example, let's take an argument which is not sound but is valid. So I'm going to produce an argument which has a valid logical structure but is not true. So premise one, if it's raining outside, then Joe Folley is a type of bird. That's my first premise. Premise two, it is raining outside. Conclusion, Joe Folley is a type of bird, right? Because the premise one is if it's raining outside, then Joe Folley is a type of bird. And it is raining outside, therefore Joe Folley is a type of bird. That is a valid argument, because there's no way for those premises to be true and the conclusion be false. So it is valid. But clearly those premises aren't true. It's not true that if it's raining outside, you're a type of bird. It's also not true that it's raining outside. So the argument is unsound, but it's still valid. So there's a separate question as to whether a logical argument is valid. Does the conclusion follow from the premises? It's then a separate question whether those premises are actually true or not.
Yes, logicians tend to be much more interested in validity than soundness, because if you're a logician attempting to craft or refine a logical system, you tend to want that logical system to apply to almost anything. You can plug almost anything you want into the variables, your arguments will still work. That's why they're kind of mainly concerned with validity rather than soundness. This is sometimes called the ideal of topic neutrality for logic, where if you at home happen to be designing a logical system, you ideally want the rules to be broad enough that you can stick literally anything in the structures and it will still work. That's kind of one of the ideals, historical ideals for a logical system.
So just to be clear, when people are arguing on the internet, if somebody says, for example, something like that, if somebody says, if the universe began to exist, then it must have a cause, and the universe did begin to exist, therefore it has a cause, and somebody goes like, oh no, that's invalid because the universe didn't have a cause. No, it's not invalid. It's unsound.
And I do
stop using the word invalid to describe arguments that are false. Only use the word invalid to describe arguments which are structurally, like the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises.
And this may seem kind of nitpicky, but it does tell you something very, very helpful about what it would take for the argument to be true. Because say you have an invalid argument in front of you, then effectively you can just kind of stop there, right? It may be that the premises are true, but it doesn't matter because the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. However, if you're saying that an argument is unsound, but nonetheless that it's valid, that does tell you something. It tells you that the denial of that argument is based on your assertion that one of the premises is false. And then you can identify which premise is false. Here you might dispute that the universe had a beginning, for example. That was, this was Aquinas' argument against, the Kalam cosmological argument. Though, of course, it wasn't known as the Kalam cosmological argument then. This kind of linear cosmological argument. Aquinas basically said, no, I don't think that it's guaranteed by by natural reason that the universe had a beginning. He did think that it had a beginning because of the Bible, but he didn't think that you could know that just through reason. And so that would be, we think about what's Aquinas doing there. Well, he's saying, I'm questioning one of those premises.
I'm saying it's a valid argument, but
yes, it's a valid argument, but
it's unsound.
Exactly. Or it's potentially, at the very least, I'm not confident enough to grant you all of those
And like
premises.
you say, importantly, if an argument is invalid, like you said, you can just stop there. So you might waste a lot of time, because if I made an argument that said, like, all Blogarts are Fogarts and X is a Blogart, therefore X is also a Flogart, you might start asking me, like, oh, well, what's a Blogart? What's a Flogart? How do you define that? What? But you could actually just like look at the argumentative structure, and if I've said something invalid in the structure, you don't even need to bother with that.
Well, at the very least, you know that argument's wrong. It might still be that their conclusion happens to be true, but it won't be guaranteed by an invalid argument.
Exactly.